The friend who wasn't just a friend. We've spent years circling this case, examining the ransom note, the basement window, the pineapple bowl, all the evidence that screams for attention. But there's something quieter that's been sitting in the timeline all along. Something so subtle that we've let it slip past us without really asking what it means. It's the presence of a lawyer in that house on the morning of December 26, 1996, before anyone had been accused of anything, before the investigation had even taken its first real breath. His name was Mike Bynum, and he wasn't just a friend stopping by to offer comfort. He was an attorney. And the question we need to ask, the question that sits uncomfortably in the center of everything, is this: why was he there at all? Theme 1. When you call a lawyer before you need one. Let's walk through this carefully, because the strangeness of it only becomes visible when we slow down and think about what actually happened that morning. The 911 call came in at 5:52 a.m. Patsy Ramsey told the dispatcher that her daughter had been kidnapped, that there was a ransom note, that she needed help immediately. Police arrived within minutes. Friends began gathering at the house, people from the neighborhood, close family friends, the kind of support network you'd expect when a family is in crisis. But somewhere in those early hours before 10 a.m., before the phone call from the supposed kidnappers was supposed to come, someone made another call. They called Mike Bynum. Now, Mike Bynum wasn't just any friend. He was John Ramsey's attorney and business partner, yes, but here's what matters. He was on vacation, winter holiday, out of town, not close by, not easily accessible, not someone you'd call for comfort when there are a dozen closer friends who could be there in 5 minutes. And yet, he got the call. He came. And by the time the police were still trying to piece together what they were dealing with, Mike Bynum was already in that house. Let's pause there for a second and think about what that means. When something terrible happens, when your child goes missing, when you're terrified and desperate, you call the people who can get to you fast. You call your sister. You call your neighbor. You call the friend who lives 2 streets over. You need arms around you. You need someone to make coffee and answer the phone and sit with you while you fall apart. That's the instinct in crisis. You pull your circle tight. But Mike Bynum wasn't in that circle. Not geographically, not functionally. He was an hour away, maybe more, enjoying a vacation that he had every reason to continue enjoying. Unless someone told him he needed to be there. Unless someone said, "You better get here, this is looking bad." And that's where the timeline starts to feel wrong. Because how could anything be looking bad when the police hadn't even begun their investigation yet? They were still operating under the assumption that this might be a real kidnapping. They were waiting for the 10 a.m. phone call. They were checking windows and doors, taking statements, trying to understand what had happened. They hadn't accused anyone. They hadn't found JonBenet's body. They were still in the earliest, most uncertain phase of the investigation. So what trouble was Mike Bynum being called to address? Let's think about this from multiple angles, because the answer isn't simple and it reveals something we'd rather not see. From a logical standpoint, the call to Mike Bynum doesn't make sense unless someone in that house already understood that this wasn't going to stay a kidnapping case for very long. You don't interrupt a lawyer's vacation for emotional support. You don't call an attorney when you need a hug. You call an attorney when you think you might need legal protection. And the only reason you'd think you need legal protection in the first few hours after your child goes missing is if you already know, consciously or unconsciously, that the investigation is going to turn toward you. Think about the other business partners John Ramsey had. Jay Alowski, for example, Pasta Jay. He was close to the family, they did business together, but he didn't get a call that morning. He found out later through the network of friends and acquaintances who were spreading the news. So why was Mike Bynum different? The answer is obvious, isn't it? Because Mike Bynum was a lawyer. That was his function. Not friendship, not comfort, legal protection. But protection from what? That's the question that won't sit still. Because if you're the victim of a crime, If your daughter has been taken by kidnappers who left a ransom note, you don't need protection from the police. You need their help. You need them to find your child. You cooperate fully. You answer every question, no matter how intrusive, because every second counts and any detail might be the one that saves her life. Unless you're not really cooperating. Unless you're already thinking about how to manage what's coming next. Let's look at this philosophically for a moment. When you bring a lawyer into a victim scenario, you're making a statement about where your priorities lie. And I don't mean that harshly, I mean it observationally. You're signaling that you're concerned about your rights, about your exposure, about how you're perceived. Those are legitimate concerns in many situations. But in a kidnapping, when your child is supposedly in the hands of dangerous people who have threatened her life, your rights shouldn't even register. Your only thought should be, how do I get her back? The shift from save my daughter to protect myself legally is a profound one. It's not a shift that happens naturally in the fog of grief and terror. It's a shift that requires a certain kind of clarity. The clarity that comes from knowing on some level that you're going to need that protection. And that knowledge has to come from somewhere. Psychologically, this tells us something important about the state of mind in that house. Panic has a signature. It's loud, it's scattered, it's reactive. When you're truly panicking, you're not thinking 3 steps ahead. You're barely thinking 1 step ahead. You're in survival mode, and survival mode is about immediate action, calling for help, searching frantically, begging anyone who will listen to do something, anything right now. But calling Mike Bynum wasn't reactive. It was strategic. It required someone to step outside the panic long enough to think, we need legal representation, and we need it before this gets worse. That's not the psychology of a parent whose child has just been kidnapped by strangers. That's the psychology of someone who understands that the story is already falling apart and that legal scrutiny is inevitable. From a physiological standpoint, stress does strange things to the body and mind. When you're in acute crisis, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that handles complex planning and decision-making, takes a back seat. Your amygdala takes over. That's the primitive emotional part of your brain that just wants to scream and run and fight. It doesn't do strategy. It doesn't think about lawyers and legal exposure and managing the narrative. It just reacts. So the fact that someone in that house had the presence of mind to call Mike Bynum tells us something about their physiological state. Either they weren't in full panic mode, which would be strange for parents whose child is missing, or they were managing their panic in a way that allowed for calculated decisions. And calculated decisions in the midst of supposed chaos are always worth examining closely. Forensic criminology gives us another lens through which to understand this. In kidnapping cases, the first 24 to 48 hours are critical. Investigators need information, and they need it fast. They need to know about family dynamics, recent conflicts, who had access to the child, what the child's routine looked like. Time is the enemy. Every hour that passes without new information is an hour where the trail gets colder and the chances of recovery diminish. Legal representation, by its very nature, slows that process down. It creates a filter. Every question gets evaluated, every answer gets vetted. The free flow of information, desperate parents spilling everything they know in the hope that something, anything might help, gets managed. Now, in many situations, that's appropriate. People have rights. They should have legal counsel. But in a kidnapping scenario where cooperation should be total and immediate, the presence of a lawyer creates friction. It signals something. It says, we're not just victims here, we're also concerned about how this looks for us. And that concern, that early concern, is what bothers me, because it shouldn't have been there yet. Let's think about this anthropologically too. Mike Bynum's presence reflects something about the social architecture of wealth and access. Most families in a kidnapping scenario don't have the option to summon a high-powered attorney at dawn. They're at the mercy of the investigation, hoping the police know what they're doing, hoping that someone somewhere is going to bring their child home. They don't have resources to mobilize, they don't have connections to leverage, they just have fear. But the Ramseys weren't most families. They had resources, they had connections, and they used them immediately, not to organize a search, not to coordinate with investigators, but to create legal protection. And that choice, because it was a choice, tells us something about what they thought they needed protection from. Now let's consider the criminal mindset for a moment. If you know something's wrong before it's been discovered, your behavior will betray that knowledge. You'll take steps that seem premature to outside observers. You'll create protections before they're needed. You'll anticipate problems that haven't materialized yet because, on some level, you know they're coming. The call to Mike Bynum is one of those steps. It's preparatory, it's anticipatory, and it shouldn't have been. Because in those early morning hours, when the police were still treating this as a legitimate kidnapping, when they were still waiting for the ransom call, when they hadn't yet searched the house thoroughly or found JonBenet's body, in those hours, there was no reason for the Ramseys to think they needed legal protection, unless they already knew. Unless someone in that house understood that this wasn't a kidnapping at all, that the ransom note was a fiction, that JonBenet wasn't coming back, and that when the truth came out, the investigation was going to turn its focus inward. That's a hard thing to sit with. But it's the only explanation that makes sense of Mike Bynum's presence that morning. He wasn't there as a friend, he was there as a lawyer, and he was there because someone knew they were going to need him. We've examined this from every angle: logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and from the perspective of a mind that's already thinking about concealment and control. And every angle points to the same uncomfortable conclusion. The call to Mike Bynum reveals foreknowledge. It reveals an understanding that legal jeopardy was coming before there was any external reason to believe it. That's not how victims behave. That's how people who know they're about to become suspects behave. And the fact that it happened so early, so quickly before the investigation had even begun to ask hard questions, that tells us something we can't ignore. Someone in that house knew, and they made the call. Theme 2. What a lawyer does in a room full of victims. So Mike Bynum is in the house now. It's mid-morning, maybe earlier. The police are still trying to get their bearings. Friends and family are arriving, gathering in the living room, the kitchen, wherever there's space. Everyone's waiting. Waiting for the phone call. Waiting for instructions, waiting for some sign that JonBenet is okay and that this nightmare is going to end. And in the middle of all this, there's a lawyer. Let's think about what that means functionally. What does a lawyer do at a kidnapping scene? The answer, in a normal kidnapping scenario, is nothing. Because in a normal kidnapping, the family doesn't need a lawyer. They need investigators, they need search teams, they need negotiators who can talk to the kidnappers and bring the child home safely. A lawyer serves no function in that equation. A lawyer doesn't find missing children. A lawyer doesn't negotiate with criminals. A lawyer protects clients from legal exposure. So the fact that Mike Bynum was there at all tells us something about what was really happening in that house. It tells us that someone understood, either consciously or on some instinctive level, that this wasn't about finding JonBenet anymore. It was about managing the fallout. It was about creating boundaries. It was about making sure that when the questions started coming, they'd be filtered through someone who understood how to protect the family legally. Let's walk through what that looks like from multiple perspectives, because the implications are profound and they ripple out in ways that reshape everything we think we know about that morning. From a logical standpoint, let's be very clear about what should have been happening. If your child has been taken and you truly believe she's with dangerous people who have threatened her life, your primary goal is cooperation. Total cooperation. The police ask you a question, you answer it immediately and completely. They want to search your house, you let them search. They want to talk to your friends, your family, your coworkers. You give them every name and number you have. Because in that moment, you're not thinking about privacy or rights or how things look. You're thinking about saving your child. But that's not what a lawyer's presence facilitates. A lawyer's job is to create boundaries, to say, my clients won't answer that question right now. To say, you'll need a warrant for that. To say, we need to talk privately before we proceed. Those are all reasonable things in many legal contexts. But in a kidnapping? When every second counts and information is the only currency that might buy your child's life back? Boundaries are obstacles. So Mike Bynum's presence in that house fundamentally changed the nature of the investigation. It changed the relationship between the family and the police from one of desperate collaboration to something more guarded, more careful, more adversarial. And that shift happened before there was any reason for it to happen. The police weren't treating the Ramseys as suspects yet, they were treating them as victims. But someone decided that victimhood wasn't enough. Someone decided that legal protection was necessary. And that decision tells us something we'd rather not acknowledge. Let's think about this philosophically. There's a moral dimension to bringing a lawyer into a victim scenario that we need to sit with for a moment. When you prioritize legal protection over cooperation with an investigation into your child's disappearance, you're making a statement about what you value most. And I don't say that to judge. People are complicated. Decisions made in crisis are rarely pure or simple. But the statement is there nonetheless, and it says, I'm concerned about how this looks for me. It says, I need to protect my interests. It says, I'm not just a victim here, I'm also someone who might be blamed, and I need to prepare for that possibility. Now, you could argue that those are reasonable concerns. Anyone who's watched the news knows that families of victims often come under suspicion, sometimes unfairly. Anyone who's read about wrongful accusations knows that innocent people need legal protection. So maybe the Ramseys were just being prudent. Maybe they were just protecting themselves from a system that might turn on them unfairly. But here's what bothers me about that explanation. It's too sophisticated for the moment. It requires a level of foresight and calculated thinking that doesn't match the emotional reality of discovering your child is missing. When you're in the grip of genuine terror, when your 6-year-old daughter is supposedly in the hands of kidnappers who have explicitly threatened to hurt her if you don't follow their instructions, you're not thinking about false accusations and wrongful suspicion. You're not thinking 3 days ahead to when the media might turn on you. You're thinking about right now. You're thinking about how to get her back alive, unless you already know she's not coming back. Unless you already know the kidnapping isn't real. Unless you already know that the investigation is going to circle back to the family because there's nowhere else for it to go. Psychologically, Mike Bynum's presence reveals something about the state of mind in that house that morning. Think about what having a lawyer present does to the atmosphere. It creates a layer of formality. It creates a sense that everything being said is being recorded, evaluated, potentially used later. It puts people on guard. And that's fine in a courtroom or a business negotiation, but it's strange in a crisis. In crisis, people usually drop their guards. They become raw. They say things they wouldn't normally say because they're too scared or too desperate to filter themselves. And that rawness is actually helpful in an investigation because it means information flows freely, details emerge that might not emerge in a more guarded conversation. But when a lawyer is present, that rawness gets managed. The script gets tightened. The story becomes more coherent, more controlled, more careful. And careful is the last thing you'd expect from parents whose child has just been taken. So the fact that the Ramseys had legal counsel that morning, before the investigation had even begun to suspect them of anything, tells us that someone in that house was already thinking about narrative control. Someone was already thinking about how to manage the story, how to shape the information, how to protect against scrutiny that hadn't even materialized yet. That's not panic. That's strategy. And strategy requires a certain kind of clarity that shouldn't exist in a moment of genuine crisis. From a physiological perspective, there's something worth noting about stress responses and decision-making. When your body is flooded with stress hormones, when your fight or flight response is fully activated, your brain prioritizes immediate action over long-term planning. You're not thinking about legal strategy. You're barely thinking at all in the rational, linear sense. You're operating on instinct and emotion. But the decision to have Mike Bynum present required prefrontal cortex function. It required the part of the brain that plans, that anticipates, that strategizes. And that part of the brain doesn't function well under extreme stress, which means that either the stress wasn't as extreme as it should have been, which would be strange for parents whose child is missing, or someone was managing their stress in a way that allowed for calculated decisions. Either way, it's worth noting, because the physiology of genuine panic doesn't look like this. It doesn't look like calling your attorney and creating legal boundaries before anyone's accused you of anything. It looks like chaos, it looks like desperation, it looks like people falling apart, and that's not what we see in that house that morning. Forensic criminology gives us another lens. In cases where family members are involved in a child's disappearance, one of the early indicators is a shift from cooperation to defensiveness. It's a subtle thing, but investigators are trained to watch for it. Most innocent families will cooperate beyond what's comfortable because they're desperate for any help they can get. They'll let police search their house top to bottom. They'll submit to polygraphs. They'll answer invasive questions about their marriage, their finances, their mental health, whatever it takes. But families with something to hide start creating boundaries early. They lawyer up. They limit access. They control the flow of information. Not because they're criminals necessarily, but because they understand on some level that full cooperation is going to lead somewhere they don't want to go. The Ramseys created those boundaries on day one, before the police had even asked for a formal interview, before there was any suggestion that they might be involved. They had legal representation in place, ready to filter every interaction, ready to say no when necessary. And that early defensiveness is significant. It's one of the behavioral markers that investigators look for when trying to understand whether a family is being truthful about what they know. Now let's think about this anthropologically. Mike Bynum's presence reveals something about class and access that we can't ignore. Wealthy families have resources that most families don't. They have lawyers on retainer, they have connections to power, they have the ability to mobilize sophisticated protection very quickly. And in many contexts, that's not a problem, that's just how society works. But in a kidnapping investigation where the goal should be total transparency and cooperation, wealth creates a barrier. It creates a two-tiered system where some families can protect themselves from scrutiny while others can't. The Ramseys used their resources immediately. They created a legal shield before anyone had thrown a punch. And that shield, while perfectly legal and within their rights, fundamentally changed the investigation. It meant that police couldn't just ask questions and get answers. They had to negotiate. They had to work around boundaries. They had to treat the Ramseys not as victims seeking help, but as clients being represented by counsel. And that changes everything. Finally, let's consider this from the perspective of someone who understands concealment and control. If you know something that you don't want discovered, your first priority is limiting information flow. You don't want to lie. Lies are easy to catch. But you also don't want to tell the whole truth. So you create layers. You create filters. You put someone between yourself and the questions who can manage what gets said and what doesn't. A lawyer serves that function perfectly. A lawyer can say, "My client won't comment on that," without the client having to lie. A lawyer can redirect questions, ask for clarification, buy time to think. A lawyer creates space between the truth and the investigation. And the fact that the Ramseys had that space available to them on the morning of December 26th before anyone knew what had really happened to JonBenet, is significant. It meant that from the very beginning, the investigation was working with filtered information. It was working with a version of events that had been reviewed and approved by legal counsel. Not the raw, unfiltered truth, the managed truth. And managed truth is always suspicious. Because if you have nothing to hide, why manage it? Why not just let the truth spill out, messy and uncontrolled, and trust that your innocence will be apparent? The answer, of course, is that innocence wasn't apparent. Because innocence wasn't the whole story, and someone in that house knew it. We've walked through what Mike Bynum's function was that morning, and it's clear now, isn't it? He wasn't there to help find JonBenet. He wasn't there to coordinate with investigators or organize search teams or offer emotional support to devastated parents. He was there to create a legal buffer. He was there to manage the narrative. He was there to make sure that when the investigation started asking hard questions, the answers would be carefully controlled. And he was there because someone understood before the rest of the world did that hard questions were coming. That the kidnapping story wasn't going to hold. That the police were going to start looking at the family. And that when they did, the family needed to be ready. That's not how victims behave. That's how people who know they're about to become suspects behave. And the fact that it happened so early, so quickly, before there was any external reason to think legal protection was necessary, tells us something profound about what was really known in that house that morning. Theme 3. The call that reveals too much. Let's come back to the central mystery, the question that sits at the heart of Mike Bynum's presence. Who made the call and when? Because that timeline matters more than almost anything else. It's one thing to lawyer up after the police start asking uncomfortable questions. It's another thing entirely to lawyer up before the questions have even been asked. And the difference between those two scenarios tells us everything about what was really happening in that house. We know a few things for certain. The 911 call came in at 5:52 a.m. Police arrived shortly after, within minutes. The house began filling with people, friends from the neighborhood, Fleet and Priscilla White, Father Roll, victim advocates. By mid-morning, the house was crowded, and somewhere in that window, we don't know exactly when, Mike Bynum got a phone call telling him he needed to be there. He was on vacation, out of town, enjoying the winter holiday that he'd planned and paid for. And someone interrupted that vacation with news urgent enough to make him pack up and drive back to Boulder. Not because there was something he could do to help find JonBenet. Not because his presence would comfort the family, but because, and this is what we have to sit with, someone thought his legal expertise was necessary. Before 10 a.m., before the ransom call was supposed to come, before the police had done more than a preliminary sweep of the house, someone made that call. Who was it, and what did they say? Let's think about this logically first, because the timeline creates some uncomfortable constraints. If the call happened very early, say, in the first hour after police arrived, then it came from someone who was already thinking about legal protection while the investigation was still in its infancy. While police were still operating under the assumption that this was a legitimate kidnapping. While everyone was still waiting for the 10 a.m. phone call that would supposedly bring instructions for JonBenet's return. At that point in the morning, there was no reason to think legal protection was necessary. The police were treating the Ramseys as victims. They were following the ransom notes timeline. They were preparing for a call from kidnappers. So what prompted someone to think, we need Mike Bynum here? The only logical explanation is that someone in that house already knew the kidnapping story wasn't real. Someone already understood that when the truth came out, and it would come out, the investigation was going to focus on the family. And they wanted legal protection in place before that shift happened. That's not paranoia, that's not prudence, that's foreknowledge. Now, if the call happened later, say closer to 10 a.m. or after, then it might have come in response to something specific. Maybe the police started asking questions that made someone nervous. Maybe the way the investigation was unfolding made it clear that the family was going to be scrutinized. Maybe someone realized that the story they'd built wasn't holding up under even basic questioning. But even that scenario is troubling. Because by 10 a.m. nothing had fallen apart yet. JonBenet's body hadn't been found. The police hadn't formally shifted their focus to the family. The investigation was still in information-gathering mode. So even if the call came later in that window, it was still premature, it was still anticipatory. It was still someone thinking several steps ahead and understanding that legal protection was going to be necessary before there was any external evidence that it would be. Let's think about this philosophically. There's something profound about the decision to call a lawyer in the midst of a crisis. It requires you to step outside the emotional chaos and think strategically about your future. It requires you to imagine a scenario where you're not just a victim seeking help, but a person who might be blamed for something you didn't do, or something you did. That kind of thinking doesn't happen naturally in genuine panic. When you're truly desperate, when your child is truly missing and you truly believe she's in danger, you're not thinking about how to protect yourself legally. You're not thinking about false accusations or media scrutiny or how the police might misinterpret your behavior. You're thinking about one thing: getting your child back. So the fact that someone in that house had the clarity, the presence of mind to make that call tells us something about their emotional state. Either they weren't as panicked as they should have been, which would be strange for parents whose child has been taken, or they were panicked about something other than JonBenet's safety. They were panicked about exposure, about discovery, about the story falling apart. And that kind of panic, the kind that makes you think about lawyers and legal protection, comes from guilt. Not necessarily guilt about harming JonBenet directly, though that's possible, but guilt about knowing something you're not supposed to know. Guilt about understanding that the truth is dangerous. Guilt about recognizing that when the police figure out what really happened, you're going to need someone to stand between you and the consequences. Psychologically, the call to Mike Bynum reveals a splitting that shouldn't exist in that moment. One part of the mind is supposed to be completely consumed with finding JonBenet, with hoping against hope that she's okay, with cooperating fully with anyone who might help. But another part of the mind is already calculating risk, already planning for legal jeopardy, already building defenses. Those two states of mind don't coexist naturally. The desperate parent doesn't think like a defendant. The victim doesn't think like someone who needs protection from the investigation. The person who truly believes their child is with kidnappers doesn't waste mental energy on legal strategy. Unless they know she's not with kidnappers. Unless they know the whole story is a fiction designed to buy time, to create distance, to point the investigation in the wrong direction. In which case, calling a lawyer makes perfect sense. Because if you know the story is false, then you also know that when it unravels, you're going to be standing in the center of the unraveling, trying to explain why you lied. From a physiological perspective, let's think about what stress does to decision-making. Acute stress narrows your focus. It limits your ability to think complexly or plan ahead. Your body is in survival mode, which means your brain is prioritizing immediate action over future consequences. You're reactive, not strategic. But the call to Mike Bynum required strategic thinking. It required someone to imagine a future scenario, police suspicion, media scrutiny, legal jeopardy, and take steps to prepare for it. That requires prefrontal cortex function, the part of the brain that handles planning and complex decision-making. And that part of the brain doesn't work well under extreme stress. So either the stress level in that house wasn't as extreme as it should have been, which tells us something important about whether the crisis was genuine, or someone was managing their stress response well enough to think strategically despite it. and managing stress that effectively in the midst of your child's disappearance is unusual. It suggests a certain emotional distance from the event, a certain ability to compartmentalize, a certain control. Forensic criminology teaches us to pay attention to early behaviors because they're harder to fake. The first few hours after a crime are critical for understanding what people really know and what they're really thinking. Later on, stories get refined, alibis get coordinated, explanations get polished. But in those first few hours, people's true state of mind tends to show through. And what showed through that morning was a concern about legal exposure, not a concern about JonBenet's safety, though that concern may have been present too, but a specific, sophisticated concern about how the family would be perceived by investigators and what kind of protection they would need when scrutiny began. That concern shouldn't have existed yet. Not in those early hours when the police were still treating them as victims. Not when the investigation was still operating under the assumption that the ransom note was real and that JonBenet was with external kidnappers who would be calling at 10 a.m. with instructions. The fact that the concern existed anyway, the fact that someone understood they needed legal protection before there was any external reason to think so, is one of the most damning pieces of behavioral evidence in the entire case, because it reveals foreknowledge. It reveals an understanding that the story being told to police wasn't the whole truth, and that when investigators started digging, they were going to find contradictions that needed to be managed. From an anthropological perspective, the call to Mike Bynum reflects a certain kind of social privilege. Not everyone has a lawyer they can call at dawn. Not everyone has the resources to mobilize sophisticated legal protection within hours of a crisis. Most families, if they find themselves suspected in their child's disappearance, have to navigate that suspicion alone or with a public defender assigned later. They don't have someone in their corner from minute one, shaping the narrative, creating boundaries, managing the flow of information. The Ramseys had that, and they used it immediately, which meant that from the very beginning the investigation was working with a version of events that had been filtered through legal counsel. The police weren't getting raw, unguarded testimony, they were getting managed testimony. Testimony that had been reviewed and approved. Testimony that protected the family's interests while appearing to cooperate with the investigation. And that management, that early management, tells us something about what needed to be protected. Because if the truth was simple, if JonBenet had really been taken by an intruder and the family had nothing to hide, then there would be no need for management. The truth would be its own defense, but if the truth was complicated, if there were things that couldn't be said or that needed to be said carefully, then management was essential. Finally, let's think about this from the perspective of someone who understands concealment. If you know something you're not supposed to know, your first instinct is to control who you talk to and what you say. You don't want to be caught off guard. You don't want to accidentally reveal something that will unravel your story. So you create a buffer. You put someone between yourself and the questions who can buy you time to think, who can redirect uncomfortable inquiries, who can protect you from saying too much. Mike Bynum served that function. He was the buffer. He was the person who could step in and say, "My clients need a break," or "That question isn't appropriate right now," or "We'll need to consult before answering that." He gave the Ramseys control over a situation that should have been completely out of their control. And that control, that early control, before the investigation had even begun to suspect them, is revealing. Because control is what you seek when you're afraid of what might be discovered, when you know there are cracks in your story that could widen under pressure, when you understand that the truth, if it comes out unmanaged, will destroy the narrative you're trying to maintain. So who made the call? We may never know for certain. The timeline is fuzzy. Different accounts give different details. But what we do know is this: someone in that house, in the early hours of December 26th, understood that legal protection was necessary. Someone recognized that the investigation was going to turn toward the family and that they needed to be ready. Someone had the clarity of mind, in the midst of supposed chaos, to think about legal strategy and narrative control. And that someone made a phone call that reveals more about what was really happening in that house than almost any other single action that morning. We've circled this from every angle: logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and from the perspective of a mind trying to control a situation that's spiraling out of control. And every angle points to the same conclusion. The call to Mike Bynum wasn't a reasonable precaution. It wasn't prudent planning. It was evidence of foreknowledge. Someone knew the kidnapping story wasn't real. Someone knew JonBenet wasn't coming back. Someone knew the investigation was going to focus on the family because there was nowhere else for it to focus, and that someone picked up the phone and called a lawyer before the police had even begun to suspect that legal protection might be necessary. That's not how victims behave. That's how people with something to hide behave. And the fact that it happened so early, so quickly, so strategically, that tells us everything we need to know about what was really known in that house that morning. The call was made, the lawyer came, and from that moment forward, the investigation wasn't working with the truth. It was working with a version of the truth that had been carefully managed, carefully controlled, carefully shaped to protect the people who should have been the most eager to cooperate. Because they weren't eager to cooperate, they were eager to protect themselves. And that eagerness, that early strategic eagerness, is one of the clearest signs we have that something in that house was very, very wrong. We've walked through the presence of Mike Bynum that morning, a lawyer who arrived before anyone knew there was something to defend against. We've examined the call that brought him there, the function he served, and what his presence reveals about the state of mind in that house. And what we've found is a pattern of behavior that doesn't match the story we've been told. Victims don't call lawyers before investigations begin. Victims don't create legal boundaries when they should be creating channels of communication. Victims don't manage their truth. They share it desperately, hoping it will save the person they love. But someone in that house was managing. Someone was calculating. Someone understood before the rest of the world did that this wasn't a kidnapping at all, and that when the truth came out, legal protection was going to be the only thing standing between them and the consequences. Mike Bynum's presence is a thread, and when you pull it, the whole narrative starts to unravel. Because his function that morning wasn't to help find JonBenet, it was to prepare for what was coming next. And the only way you prepare for something is if you already know it's on its way. Next time, we'll turn our attention to the ransom note itself, the letter that was too long, too specific, too familiar. The letter that knew things only someone inside that house could know. The letter that functioned not as a ransom demand, but as a story designed to point the investigation away from the truth. Because the truth was already there, waiting in the basement, and someone in that house knew it.